Okay, now we're live. So, I was just complaining to Pat and to the audience about YouTube having changed some of the way some of these things work on the back end. So it's irritating, and it's like I take like a week off and everything goes to pot. So, welcome everybody to the informal chat about strategic level Napoleonics games. There was a lot of reaction in response to the video earlier this week, so I figured we would circle back. I have enrolled Pat Mullen, who is here. How you doing, Pat?
Doing good.
To talk about some of these games that he has played in the past, and I had a couple of corrections that I wanted to mention. Corrections and additions, I guess. One of which is the thing you're seeing on the screen right now, which is La Guerre de l'Empereur, which is Kevin Zucker's strategic level Napoleonics game. I don't know a whole lot about it, which is one reason why I left it off the list. It is an area movement game. It has art by Christopher Moeller. It has okay looking components, I think. The map is pretty dull, but I have spoken to people who like it. Go ahead.
It has a very short playing time for its scope, and based on what it says on Board Game Geek, and a fairly low rating. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that's not a spectacular rating, that's for sure. Where do you even see 240? You know what? I don't even look at the playing time that Board Game Geek says, because it a lot of times it seems like there's like a maximum of like 240 minutes, and it doesn't make any sense. So looking at the game I know plays in, so this is realistic, 120 to 12,000 minutes with Empires in Arms.
That's correct.
That sounds reasonable.
100% correct. That is 100% correct.
Okay.
What other corrections did you want to make before we?
Le Grand Armée. So there's two, as I mentioned in the previous video, there's two different versions of the game. And it does sound, having learned a little more about it, as though the second game from Spitzer does kind of descend from the original game from SPI. Furthermore, this original SPI game is a very early SPI game, 1972. But it does cover multiple campaigns. It's not just 1813, which it doesn't cover at all. It is, in fact, 1805 in Austria, 1806 versus Prussia, and 1809, again, the Danube campaign. And looking at the map, we have a sort of okay... This is super early SPI, right? This is 1972. So the original game covers a little more than anticipated, and then the TSR game covers... It isn't quite strategic level, apparently. I mean, you can see that it leaves the Peninsular War completely off. It's more of a grand operational, whatever that means, type of thing. I still don't have it. I'm kind of working on getting a copy, but we'll see if that actually occurs. I'm unwilling to pay a ton of money for it, because it's kind of renowned as a less amazing game. So anyway,
right.
Let's circle back to games that we've seen or have played or have some experience with. And Pat has played a fair amount, or quite a lot, it sounds like, of Empires in Arms, the old classic from Australian Design Group, and later, not much later, by Avalon Hill. I think probably you played the Avalon Hill version.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I've seen I've seen the Australian Design Group version, and it's just a more primitive version of what was finalized, for the Avalon Hill version.
Mm-hmm.
They did they redid stuff for the final Avalon Hill version. When it came out, which is eons ago, actually. What is it, 1983? If I recall correctly.
That's what this says, yeah. That's the... Let's look at versions. Actually, so Australian Design Group is 83. The Avalon Hill edition, according to BGG, is 86, which is interesting.
That sounds about right. I mean, I was young then, so those 3 years are going to bleed together.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, right. Yeah, I think I was in high school when I first played it. So we figured we divide this up into talking about the game as a game, right? And then later we can talk about how the game handles the history, and those two kind of go hand in hand. But let's start off with the game itself. What questions you got, Gary?
So it's a My understanding is that it's a considerably better game multiplayer. Is that it's like 5 to 7 player type of thing. Virtually every time I've seen it played or heard of it played, it has been played with that rough number of people.
So right, so the game offers up, and later I'll talk about like variants and player created stuff, and we get into what you referred to empires and harms and all that stuff later, right? But just talking about the base, the game is published, right? It's it maxes out at 7 players, and that would be France, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, Turkey, and Spain. And after years of playing, first of all, the first thing I'll say is the only way to play the game is as a 7-player game. If you're playing with anything less than 7 players, you end up using a rule for what they call UMPs. Yeah, I forget what the U stands for. It's basically like a bot rule, right? For a major power that's not being controlled.
Okay.
And that doesn't really work quite that well. So just as a quick, just overarching description of the game itself, right? So you've got it's an area maps, and if you take a look at that map and close up in on it that you were taking a look at, everything there right. Every province you see there, it have like money basically and manpower values, money/manpower, and then in the tiny little areas that subdivide the black provinces, right? There's a terrain type, and then there's a tiny number in there that reflects a forage value. If a unit's attempting to forage, and so the best way I can describe it is it's a grand strategic war game, but because of the 7-player thing I described that I'll get into, it's very, diplomacy is very important. In fact, the type of wargamers who would make the complaint, right, that hey, I want to play the game, not play the player. You know what I'm talking about. You played a lot of games, right?
Yeah.
That person should not play this game. Okay. Because diplomacy is really, really at the heart of it. In fact, you're engaging the best. There's a review on Board Game Geek that summed it up with the phrase, "It's a war game that's a role-playing game for 7 people." Okay, and so that's why you get like some. You had mentioned in your review some like role-playing crossover to it.
Yeah,
I don't mean literally like you're rolling up a character and play, but the idea that I am the steward of this nation.
Right.
Okay, and I'm going to try to do my best by that nation. And the people who have a lot of problems with the diplomacy aspect of it, I think at this scale, I mean the scale you're talking about, so like the basic campaign game, right?
Right.
Where you're talking 1805 to 1815,
right?
That you can't take that out of a game and play like someone had mentioned. It's why I don't like War and Peace, right? This era is not an era of industrial machines crashing against each other. Okay, it's an area where politics is very important. You know what I'm saying? And so that diplomacy, the decisions you make, and I don't mean, and I'll talk about like what I call game enforced diplomacy in the game, as well as just like normal diplomacy, right? Promises, quid pro quos, what you're going to do. Essentially, that's you as the head of the nation engaging in policy and statecraft. That's at the nub of it, though. That's the best part about the game, but it's also the weakness of the game because a lot of people don't like that. Another thing you'll get is like, somebody playing France that probably is ill-equipped to play France. You know what I mean? So if you're playing France and you treat everybody like you're Mussolini, right? That can sabotage your game and your chances of winning it long term. You know, you've got to engage in that aspect of the game and embrace it. And so the game, I don't want to get into like phase after phase or anything, but the
Right.
game has a dedicated diplomacy phase where it could go on as long as you want it to. Yeah, it's up to the group to draw a line, right? And but that's where you're pulling people aside and talking about what you want to do and what you want to what you can offer them, and and then they're getting pulled aside by other people and they're making offers, and that sort
Right.
of thing. Also in the game though, there's a game enforced diplomatic mechanics that so when you declare war on somebody, if you can, right, when there's a phase each turn you're in war where players can offer to surrender. Okay, it's a very simple, and so what you do is you'd write it down on a piece of paper, right?
Okay.
And you would offer conditional or unconditional. All right, and that's if the country you're at war with, the countries you're at war with, want to offer to hear peace offers, right? If they decide that they want to hear peace offers and you offer a conditional, they have to take it. They don't have a choice. No, I'm sorry. They can refuse it. Refuse it. But if you offer unconditional, they're forced to accept it. And without going into like the nitnoid detail of it, a conditional surrender is a lighter surrender, and there are options that if there are multiple powers at war or one power at war, I believe you can choose like for conditional a max of 2 conditions, and if it's an unconditional a max of 3 conditions. And there are things like, reparations, loss of territory. You can enforce a royal marriage, which gives you more political points. Which and the winning of the game is like there's a political track that shows how many victory points you're going to get every quarter, and it also shows like different levels of like costs to do things, as well as like you can move into an instability zone which would force you to make an unconditional surrender to everybody. And political points are impacted by like winning and losing battles and taking capitals, of miners and stuff like that, as well as like I pointed out, you'll take a political point hit in a surrender. A less egregious one for a conditional, a more egregious one if you unconditionally surrender. One of the conditions in the game, for instance, for both the conditional and unconditional, is a truce. And like for the conditional, I believe it's 18 month turns, month turns, and unconditional, it can be 36 months, a truce period. So things like that, as well as also if you formally ally with somebody and someone declares war on you, you can call them as an ally. If they refuse, they will lose a significant amount of political points.
Okay.
All right. So, and you can't attack an ally. If you decide to attack an ally, you have to break the alliance, and then you're going to spend political points to declare war. You know what I mean? So it's egregious. So, and to formally ally, 2 nations just state they are formally allying. And it's noted. As such. So, these enforceable. Game enforceable diplomatic mechanics are almost unique to Empire and Arms. I haven't seen it in too many other games out there. That
that doesn't sound super familiar, to be honest. I mean, a lot of games that seem to have. I mean, so another game like a not diplomacy game where there's like no game under the diplomacy game. Here I Stand, or Virtue Queen for that matter, which has both of which have a discrete diplomacy phase, and not a lot of structure behind that diplomacy phase. I mean, they do say there's conditions under which you have to uphold the deal and that kind of thing, but this sounds like it's more, unsurprisingly, perhaps more structured than what we would see in a Here I Stand or Virgin
Right.
Queen family of games. That
And to be honest with you, the diplomacy rules aren't later we'll talk about Rolandism and Chrome, right? And bloat. But the diplomacy rules themselves aren't difficult at all to suss out. What I just described to you,
right.
like literally, they're really easy. But having that technique in the game is what then ties it to the grand strategic combat you're doing. So in terms of like the actual military units themselves, you're talking about core, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And the core are basically hidden information units. There are core that are out there.
Uh-huh.
The French first, second, third, fourth, whatever. Countries have cores.
Mm-hmm.
In the original, in the game, you'd have these photocopiable, cardboard sheets, right?
Mm-hmm.
And different nations' core compositions are different. So you might have like French infantry corps are generally bigger, okay, and can hold more cavalry. And they have cavalry corps that hold more cavalry.
Okay.
And this kind of but as a basic idea, that's how all the countries work, right? Okay, and there's some special corps, like I said, cavalry corps. They're also guard corps. So when you get into combat, what one tactic you're looking at, which is just each side chooses some chits, and there's some tables you compare things against, and you lose round by round in a battle that can go multiple days, right? Round by round, you'll take losses and you lose morale. And if you're wiped out or you break, you lose.
Okay.
And then there's a follow-up pursuit phase, which is basically a grand calculus of how long did the combat go, how much morale did the attacker lose, how much cavalry does each side have, what kind of terrain were you in, and so follow-up damage done by cavalry pursuit, from the winner to the loser, taking from cavalry first. Okay. That's the basics of the combat system. It can get a little fiddly in terms of like looking at the charts, you know what I mean, and that kind of stuff. But once you've done it, it's not that hard. And in fact, some of the more ridiculous arguments out there amongst experienced players and Crips and Bloods about the game are about like, should you use a calculator or should you use the charts that lay out like the odds of one blah against blah that come with the game? And I'm firmly in the land of use the charts, dude. You know what I mean, right? Yeah, you know what I mean. You just take the game as it's given to you. And they've given you these charts and tell you to use them. Why would you then want to use a calculator and be like, hey, I think I squeezed an extra 0.1 morale out of this? It's just the typical Munchkin min-maxing, as far as I'm concerned, which plays into the Rolandism and the rules bloat that we'll talk later. Okay, all right. But so having said that, so you've got 7 countries, and from a game is game, they did a very good job. Every country has its thing. So this is getting that role-playing aspect, right? Every country kind of has something that it does pretty well. Better than other people, like a special ability, right? Okay, no joke. So Great Britain has the most fleets. Okay? And because of how the trade rules work in the game, she's generally going to be the richest. She also has a very high morale, because every country's like infantry morale and stuff is different, base morale. Okay, she has the next to France has the highest straight infantry morale, right? Britain has the second highest, but she also has like a pretty good guard levying within her core, but she has the smallest amount of total core that she can build. It's smallest army. That's Britain's thing. Britain wins if nobody else wins the game.
Okay.
The way the victory point things works, I don't want to get into the numbers, right? Because it will all get lost, right? But basically, everybody bids for a country. So everybody writes down bids, and you kind of go down and compare the bids in a specific order. Compare for France, compare for Britain, right?
Okay.
And that's a penalty of victory points you're going to pay to have that country.
Okay, that's pretty... I've seen Harry using that mechanic elsewhere. Whiff uses that to determine who gets to play the Axis, for example.
Right. And it works well with this. What you want to do, like everybody should be, if you've got experienced players, right, or smart players, right. For instance, everybody should be scared of somebody who gets France for a song, right? Okay, because but then alternately, everybody should be scared of a France that needs to pay the piper because she's going to have to get those victory points,
Mm-hmm.
So that's so anyway. So France's thing is they have Napoleon.
Mm-hmm.
They have the biggest army. They have a really high manpower as well as a decent economy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And their basic infantry morale is 4, whereas for most other, so the way morale works for a battle is like you say, right, so I have 10 infantry and my infantry have 3 because I'm a normal country, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's 30, right?
Okay.
And then I have 10 guard and guard have 5. So I'm lucky I have 10. So then I add in 50. Okay. So that's my number there. And then you divide by the total number of factors you have, right? And that's your morale for the battle. You know what I mean? The number that gets detracted from as morale gets taken from you. Okay. All cavalry except Spanish, the poor Spanish, have like 4. Spanish have 3.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So going through the countries, right? Prussia's got a decent army, but she's like in the middle of Europe, right? She's very vulnerable to everybody. But she has a special ability where she can store manpower. So even if she's not building, everybody else, when they do their builds every quarter, they got to build. And if they, I have excess manpower. Oh, shuckies. I can't do anything with it. Prussia can stock that away. So Prussia could be like knocked down and then get a huge British subsidy and have a lot of socked away manpower. You know what I mean? And then boom, build an army out of nothing. Rise from the ashes. Austria has a decent economy, a big army, the second best leader in the game to Napoleon, which is, in the estimation of that game, it's Charles. As well as having what I call like all the bells and whistles. They got pretty good cav corps, their corps kind of big compared to like other countries. They do actually have guard corps, which only in the game only the Prussians, the Russians, and the French have guard. Like an actual, and that's a tactic when you're doing the battles is I'm going to commit the guard, right? Which gives you gives you a chance to push the can I get a morale push here and knock the guy over and win the battle, so that's Austria. Russia has the ability to build Cossacks, forages at within her own territories at a lesser penalty, even than other countries in their own territory. Gets a bonus to defense and a bonus to defense in Russia, as well as like being, fairly big army if maxed out. It's got a decent navy. I think they're number 3 in the game. And then we get to the little boys that a lot of people don't like to play, that whenever I do decide to Empires and Arms, I love playing these countries, and that's Turkey and Spain.
Mm-hmm. And
Spain's their thing is they have the second biggest fleet. So they're portable. You know what I mean? They're valuable, but part of Spanish statecraft is knowing, hey, don't sell that fleet sharply, and as long as it's preserved, you're valuable. If it gets shagged out, you're less valuable. Turkey's thing is, she has the crappiest army in terms of morale and stuff like that, but she has these things called feudal corps, and they have crappy morale, feudal cavalry and feudal infantry corps, and like really crappy. Like I think they have normal janissary corps that kind of compete with the European powers and their morale values, but these feudal corps are horrible. The feudal infantry, if I recall correctly, have a morale of 1. And the feudal cavalry have a morale of 2, but their thing is they can recreate them every year. Just pop every single one up on the map. So they can basically take their whole army practically and not worry. All they have to worry about is like paying for supply, if they so choose, or they could just forage and take foraging losses, which are a thing in the game, and just play a numbers game. And in a Turkey, I've seen very successfully fight wars, especially on the defense in that game, right? With just playing the numbers game, like, all right, I'm going to attack you. I'm probably going to lose, and I'm going to lose some political points. That's going to stink, but I'm going to just shag your expensive army out, And if I actually get lucky and win the battle, I've got all this cavalry here, and I could you could literally be destroyed tomorrow, and then who's in trouble now? So those are kind of a basic look at the different countries and just militarily how the game works. And it's, like I said, it's monthly turns. You pay for supply every turn. You collect income and you decide what you're going to build every quarter. And that's the game. Their combat is affected by these leaders I'm talking about. Wellington is probably the third best leader in the game. And the way they work is they each have, I believe, watch me get the terms wrong, but it's, I believe, a tactical, a strategic, and a core maximum rating. Okay? So the tactical is compared against somebody else, like another leader. The advantage you're going to have round by round in combat. So Napoleon's like a 5. So if he's up against like a guy with a 2, he's going to have... You look at a chart, and what it basically means, Napoleon's going to have +1 to every roll, and the other guy's probably going to have a -1. That's just life, The strategic level number is about doing things like, it's a number on a D6 you roll under that there might be penalties to for like reinforcing an adjacent area where a battle's occurring, or you've chosen the Chit outflank, which means... It's got tactical meanings. It basically means you're going to have a pinning force and a flanking force, and they're not going to arrive till tomorrow. So you're going to have a tight battle the first day, but they're going to have a major effect when they arrive, right? But you don't know when they're going to arrive tomorrow. That strategic number helps determine that. Okay. And then the core maximum number is how many core you can command without penalty. So using Napoleon as an example, he's a 5.56. So Napoleon in the game can command 6 core without penalty. Then any additional leaders can help him by, if they're with him, by like if a cavalry leader is with him, that cavalry leader can handle the pursuit later. It gives a bonus to that pursuit thing I talked about. And then there are possible leader casualties in the game. Very, very, very difficult. Napoleon could then, using him as the example, could command 12 core, but he takes a -1 to that tactical rating and that strategic rating. So he then becomes like a 4/4/12. Up, you know what I mean? So he can command from 7 to 12 core, but he takes a penalty. So in the game, Charles is the second best leader because he's a 4/4/6. He's just a little worse than Napoleon. Good core maximum. And when we get to the history part, I'll talk a little bit about like where I think Roland came up with the numbers and why in the basic game I don't have any problem with any of this stuff. Okay, Wellington is really good. I think he's a 4.5/3. So Wellington's fantastic. It's just he's not seen in history commanding the level of troops Napoleon is. You know what I mean? So his core maximum is not as high, but boy, is he a Dashgarn leader, good leader. And then you've got all the other leaders smattered throughout the game. That's basically like an overall description of how the game works. And I like it if you're playing with 7 people. You are not playing with rules bloat. You're just playing with the basic game. Empires in Harms is the result of an interaction, in my opinion, an interaction between Empires in Arms fanboys and Harry Rowland, who you've played with, Whiff really well. Is there rules and expansion bloat in Whiff?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right. So it's like take those things and Set it loose. Like, well, what about this, Harry? Oh yeah, we could do that. We could have a special rule for that. We could have, and none of these things were ever put out as expansions, right? They're all like stuff you'd have to print up or make the counters for, that kind of thing. Okay. There was when EIA went out of print, and so the obstacles to Empires in Arms. So first of all, I think at a grand strategic level, it is a fantastic representation of the Napoleonic period. Are you going to fight the wars of the Napoleonic period in the campaign game the way they did historically? Of course not, right? What it's doing is it's representing the power politics and how they worked at that time, and the military component that existed, with everything. You follow what I'm saying?
Sure.
And I think that people who don't like the diplomacy aspect and all that, they're missing the point. You're conducting state policy. You can screw that up.
Well, I guess that's one advantage of diplomacy. The game diplomacy is that there's really no game there other than the diplomacy game, right? So no one is going to mistake it for more of a military simulation than it is, because there's no simulative content at all in diplomacy. It does sound like there's a substantial simulative content in Empires in Arms, which then has a diplomacy game with some RPG-esque feel to it. On top of that, one of the things I was going to ask, in the context of it being a 7-player game, and since I may have mentioned it, and it's come up in the chat, is Here I Stand in Virgin Queen, both of which I like, but both of which have a similar problem in that not all of the factions are equally engaging to play. In Here I Stand, for example, it's delightful to play the Protestants or the papacy, but if you're stuck with France and your objective is to build chateaus, then that's just way less interesting than the heart of the game, which is that interaction between the Protestants and the Catholics.
To that point, right? So I played this game a lot, right? I played France, I played Britain, I played all these countries. My favorite ones to play are actually Turkey or Spain.
Yeah, you mentioned that. So that makes me think that this does not fall prey to that particular problem.
But you have to have that mindset. Mm-hmm. Okay, I am Spain. I am not France. My army kind of sucks.
Right.
Okay? I am weak. My value is in my fleet, and I need to be courted for it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I need to be very judicious in how I conduct my statecraft and not get drawn into a disaster like they did historically. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Because that could ruin my experience for this game. Or at least do the best I can. And that's what I mean about the role-playing aspect kicking in. Same thing goes for Turkey, right? Prussia's a big one like that. So, I've heard of. I was talking to Tweezers the other day. We were talking a little bit about Empires in Arms, and I've played in groups that are so jaded with the game that what they'll do is like everybody like gangs up on France, and so they don't kind of try to role play it. They're doing, and it's what I don't like about like the whiff crew. Yeah, you know what I mean. Yeah, and how that dedicated lifelong, that's all you play is approach whiff, right? It's one of the things that turn me off to that. So people who play Empires in Arms like that, they're like, okay, so whoever France is, what we're all going to do is go to war with him early, and then we're not going to, we're going to make sure he can't win, and then we're going to play a game and decide that whether we're going to win within ourselves. But that's defeating the whole purpose I just described. You know what I mean? You're playing this game the way you would play like an SPNI war game. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? And it's different. It just doesn't work that way. The second thing is, so talking about like the life of Empires in Arms, there was a rich Empires in Arms play by email community for many, many years.
I find that highly believable.
Right, and I played many campaigns to conclusion in that, and even game mastered a few. So first off, you're playing by email, there has to be a game master.
Sure.
Okay, because a lot of these things, like these, like the way I described how surrenders work, you'd write it down on a piece of paper. Well, there has to be like a independent broker. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Who says, all right, by 1700 Eastern Standard Time tomorrow, so everybody's got to get into me. Their responses to the French offer of peace.
Okay.
You know what I mean? That kind of thing. Yeah, because it's all secret. It's secret from the other guy.
Mm-hmm.
Like you've got an ally, right? That's one of the neat mechanics about peace. Is he selling me out? Is he going to surrender and not tell me about it? Is he talking with the French? I don't know. So as game master, doing that, so you change little things to make the board game work in a play-by-email format, right? So one of the things was I always did was like, we're not going to wait ever for diplomacy, but diplomacy should be continuous. That's one. You know what I mean? Because we're moving at the speed of writing. The second thing is, I want to be CC'd on every diplomatic communication must be CC'd to the game master.
Reasonable.
Right. There's not. Don't get me wrong. You guys can talk. You can fight. You can lie to each other. Whatever. I just want to know what's going on because I might have to prepare some product. So I got to. It's good to have an eye over the horizon. You know what I mean? To see what's coming. And one of that thing it did is like taught me a lot of things about the game, right? And so first of all, like a common thing in 1805 is like France decides to start at war with Prussia and Austria, who decide to start the game allied, and they can hurt France, right? They can be a real task for France if they stick together early in the game. I have never, in the many campaign games I have game mastered, ever seen a situation where one of Prussia or Austria, if not both, while ostensibly fighting staunchly side by side, we're not talking terms with the French, or possible terms,
right.
or how things might look, So these ideas that the game can be like immediately defeated by beating up on France, it's not true, right? France can defeat a coalition that's actively cooperating the way France defeated a coalition historically, right? So what usually happens is one or the other, based on the personal interaction, which I take it out of it, the personalities out of it. I say it's statecraft. It's how that person's handling his state, right? France decides to beat on one guy more than everybody else, right? Like Prussia, okay? And then you're going to get a result of that. Either that guy's going to be the die-harder, or the other guys are going to be like, I don't know if I want to fight France that hard. Maybe I'll back out on that guy. Or that guy might feel like I'm not getting enough help from the Russians or Austrians, so I'm going to start at least talking with France. There are situations sometimes like that. There's that conditional unconditional mechanic, but there are other things in the diplomacy, like France promising, look, if you take an unconditional, I promise I'll do these 3 peace terms that don't involve dismantling your army or reparations or anything. Light stuff. You know what I mean? And you might find that to be agreeable. And I should have added that a country can be forced to surrender if every provincial capital and its national capital are occupied when you get to an economic phase. So it's a very difficult thing to get somebody there. Usually by that point, they've lost so many battles, they're in the instability zone. And if you go to the instability zone, you're forced to give an unconditional surrender to everybody you're at war with.
Okay.
You're just, there's a governmental change. Essentially,
right?
Right, and we got to make peace so that there's no rebellion. So that within those parameters, I think the game's fantastic. I think it's fantastic. 1805 to 1815, it can feel a little pro-French in its balance. It's not, but it can feel that way because it's Napoleon at the height of his powers, right? I played. You mentioned the 1792 campaign. It works really well.
Which, by the way, apparently first appeared in a general article.
Right. And then it got fleshed out more and I'll talk about the community ads, to all this stuff in a second. It got fleshed out a little more in the community editions, that are, most of them are, you could see them on Board Game Geek now, but for years there were websites devoted to like EIA and stuff. Like in the 90s, you could go, that's where Empires and Harms resided.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Right. Just this dedicated community. And so a lot of kinks that were in it were fleshed out, but basically the 1792 campaign, it happens after the directorate. The directory takes power. So the Jacobins are gone. Okay. And there's still a revolt in the Vendée.
Okay.
And, basically the way it works is, God, these are archaic ancient rules, but in essence, if Napoleon wins a battle and then another battle and then another, like there's a set number, his counter gets replaced. So there's a little historical determinism along the fact that he's going to become first consul.
Okay.
You know what I mean? There's no historic randomness to that. This directory thing is going to become first consul. When does that happen? It depends on how successful Napoleon is.
Okay.
Right? There's a little more, I think, feeling of, the French aren't just like the superpower at the beginning of the game. And I think it does leaven things a little bit for the Turks and the Spanish in terms of feeling their oats a little bit more, not a lot. Spain's still a basket case. Turkey's still a basket case, just not quite as badly as they were in 1805. But it's kind of a lie. France is very powerful in that game. I believe once Napoleon becomes first consul, this capability is ended. But France has the capability to do these things called levies en masse, where it doubles their manpower for an economic phase. You know what I mean? So to represent that ability that she displayed several times when she was at war. You know what I mean? With Prussia and Austria. Like, I'm wiped out, but I can just, will this army into being. So I just wanted to speak to that 1792 while you talked about it, because you talked about it. Another, I think, the most fun I've ever had playing Empires and Arms was there's a Age of Frederick variant for the game. And, it's two separate small campaigns, one based around the War of Austrian Succession and one based around the 7 Years' War.
Okay.
And that's fun because all the powers are equal. So a lot of the strengths I described for all the countries still exist, and special abilities, but the Prussian corps are better. The French corps are nerfed. You know what I mean? They're, it's Ancient Regime corps.
Right.
France has an even stronger navy, and her army is not yet started to become a little bit pathetic. Turkey's even bigger, more stable. And Frederick's the best leader in the game. So as a political competition, and given what we discussed, the role playing your policy and stuff like that, it seems to fit that era even more like a glove. Changing alliances. You start to see as the French why it's like, hey, if I'm going head to head with Austria a lot, it's really great to make deals with the Turks. That kind of thing. So, it's a fascinating game. So now let me talk a little bit about the community and rules bloat, which like I said, came way before Board Game Geek ever existed, right? And was a result of these EIA communities, and Fanboys the Game, and the catalytic chemical reaction with Harry Rowland, who never met a new rule he didn't want to write. Okay. So, so a lot of things went like the Empires and Harms rule. It's just making the game. It already delves into the operational anyway, right? I wouldn't say it's operational at all, but it delves there. We resolve battles, right?
Right.
They occur in days, etc. All that stuff is just more detail that is just not necessary, getting more granularity going on at those levels. It's a grand strategic game. You're running your country, for God's sake.
Sure.
Why do you need more detail? So the second thing that I think poor decision you'll see in a lot of like the addenda and optional rules and stuff that are out there are things that take away from some of these special abilities. So my classic example is like I described that Prussian ability, correct? Well, there's an optional rule where countries can make militia. Okay, it's not really part of the base game, but there's an optional rule where you can make militia, and it just, they're really crappy, and they have like a 2 morale level for every country that exists, and they cost no money to make. But that optional rule takes away a special ability that Prussia has.
Mm-hmm.
You follow what I'm saying?
Sure.
It was almost like it was written by somebody who's saying, hey, we have all this leftover manpower, and there were militia. Why not make it? And, Roland obliges with a rule,
Mm-hmm.
An optional rule. It's not a good idea. As an example,
am I misinterpreting the because my understanding, without having followed this game in any real sense for a long time, I don't have the impression, for the sake of clarity, that Harry himself was involved directly in a lot of this ancillary rules development that took place with this thing, which is like completely not the case with WIF, where he was at the center.
Well, there's a couple. I would like to clear his name, but I can't. So, being very involved in these communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, a lot of the optional rules came out in the general and then were repackaged in like new editions, and that was all Rowland.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Now we're not talking about WIF here, right? We're talking about Empires in Arms.
I'm talking about Empires in Arms,
okay.
Right? They would come out with articles in the general. Hey, here's a militia rule. Here's this. Here's that. Then after Avalon Hill died and the general went away and everything,
mm-hmm.
there were compilations of, this is a designer-approved new rule on this.
Huh.
This is
okay.
right. Harry tinkering, and then we get into some real crazy person land as far as I'm concerned with it. So, Empires in Arms was never published. You made that point. There's a reason it was never published, because around the time when they were looking at making the never working abortion that was the WIF computer game,
right?
They were going to make the abortion that never worked. That was the Empires in Arms video game, computer game.
Okay.
Which, if you think about it, the way I've described how this whole game works, right? If you were playing as a single player with a bunch of like AI controlled other powers, right? It would really suck, right? That would suck all the magic out of the game, right?
Oh yeah, totally.
Right. So you're left with a game, someone's trying to make a computer game like in the mid 90s, early 2000s that would allow 7 people to play. And they were and everything that was Empires in Arms was getting shoved into that idea.
Okay.
All right. So that's, by the way, that's why that never got published. I wanted to hit that. There's an actual so funny enough, I think a year, maybe 2 ago, I started and it fell apart. And I kind of knew it was going to fall apart, but I wanted to do it. It's more of a website I hang out with that involves a lot of, computer game people and board game people, that kind of thing, right? I volunteered to game master a game of Empires in Arms, right? And it was cool because I got the mix I wanted. People who knew about war games and stuff, but there were a lot of people who were more into like other types of board games. People who with experience in role-playing games, and we played for quite a few months. And what really fell apart, which I'll get to in a second, is just the logistics.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so but I'll get to that in a second. But because of that, I went to Board Game Geek and got like, all right, there's a version of the rules there that's like, these are the rules. Everything that's in this color, right,
Mm-hmm.
is stuff that's from Avalon Hill. Everything that's in this color is everything that exists that came out in the general.
Mm-hmm.
And everything in this color is stuff that came from these dedicated websites that existed at one time and have at it, right? So I actually went through the rules, knowing I was going to be game mastering this game, and I kept even some of these more player created, extra rules. But here was my mantra, right? My rubric, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
My rubric was, I had no problem with simple game rules that did things like say, hey, if this country does X, Y, and Z, they can become a dominant power, which is a thing that increases your morale level. And it's pie in the sky stuff. Like for Spain, it's like, do you control the 2 Sicilies? Do you control Morocco? Have you taken Gibraltar?
Okay.
You know what I mean? Stuff like that. So it restores you to like true dominant power status. That's an example. Another example is they had some. There are some pretty good rules out there for Turkey recreating the Ottoman Empire if she controlled enough North African and other miners
Okay.
and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So I'm like, okay, these are doable. They're not ambiguous. All they're doing is adding incentive to, like, as you asked the question about earlier, those weaker countries. You know what I mean? To give them extra stuff to do. That's cool.
Okay.
Why not? Fine. Everything that I threw out was stuff that made the game more complex in an operational way.
Okay.
So, like, there was an alternate rule for, like, so for instance, doing a naval invasion, right? It's pretty simple in the basic game. You have X number of fleets, right? And a fleet can carry a corps. And you may have to fight a naval battle, right? And then you can land. Okay, you know what I mean? Not that complicated. Well, it's these people who are in quest of realism at a grand strategic level that were like, well, how about we make a rule that a fleet can only carry 10 factors worth of units? You follow what I'm saying? Right? So now we're taking something that's kind of elegant, and we're starting to get nitnoid with it. And that's the heart, by the way, with a lot of those empires and harms rules. That's basically what they're doing. So now let's veer into the game as history, right? So the games take towards like that, like how to do a naval invasion, right? Is pretty simple.
Okay.
Right? It's grand strategic. You're playing a 10-year campaign, right? Why make this thing super complicated? Why have a special rule for other than a very basic one for like the Skagerrak?
Okay.
You know what I mean? You know what I mean? You're going into Awa or Whiffland. You know what I mean?
Right.
With these little ideas. So a classic one that I've seen argued about and that's constantly changed is just the core compositions, right? So it basically is from what I can tell you, from my observation and knowing Napoleonic history, military history, right? Rowland took a look at all these countries and said, what did their cores kind of look like at more of a maximal level, roughly, by 1815? You know what I mean? As a max out. You know what I mean? So, and then it's 1805. Well, go, okay. You know the Austrians, but the Austrians didn't have a second Grenadier Corps. Or their Grenadier Corps didn't. They weren't really Grenadier Corps. That's the type of argument you'll get. It's what I call Napoleonic pedantry. You know what I mean? Yes. This is a grand strategic game that takes place over a 10-year period. You know what I mean? So getting it, pulling out your copy of, I have it sitting by my bedside of your copy. I always get his name wrong. That's why I'm looking at it. Chandler's The Campaigns of Napoleon, right?
Great book.
Right. And trying to nitnoid this thing, you know what I mean, to get it right, is missing the point entirely. They do and they take the same approach with the 1792 campaign. In fact, you could make the argument, hey, these nations weren't using core systems at this date. Yes, we all know that. It's an artifice for something to throw factors into. You know what I mean? And then things get commanded. And that's it. So most of the crazy rules bloat that leads nowhere and all that leads to that purpose. But it got to that point where I literally said, okay, I'm just going to, since somebody did this wonderful thing and made this thing with multicolored text, right? If I'm going to run a campaign, I'm going to go through and I cut out a lot of the stuff that just added nitnoid bullshit, right? And then just permanently left that out. And then I actually went to my playing group, right? Like you would a role-playing group, right? And I said, okay, here are these optionals. I'm going to post them, and I need votes from everybody on them. But as a game master, I'm going to give you my recommendation, why I like it, why I don't like it. For some of the Ottoman Empire stuff, right?
Right.
Okay, right? And went through it, and then they voted. We used whatever they chose. And then I compiled it and said, okay, here's a Word doc for everybody. In fact, I'll like as you would prefer, I'll pre-tag it and do it in PDF. Yay, right? Because it's not that hard these days, right? So I did all that for everybody. And when the game fell apart, the funny reason is I've seen play by email games which require a lot more effort, but on the part of the game master. But what happened here was basically the vassal module really sucked. And so I was left, for everything I'm talking about, for such a popular game, it has the worst graphically, interactive nature, ability to be used for 7 people, everything vassal module I've ever seen for such a theoretically popular title. Yeah. So I was literally left with making altering player aids that existed on Board Game Geek for like Excel spreadsheets for the economic worksheets and stuff, that type of stuff, and having people like do their mechanics and mail it back to, and that defeated it. If there was a better, like more on a level of a very good vassal module, like I've described you, like Vietnam, or some of the really good ones that are out there, there would have been no problems. But it basically became too much bandwidth for the players, and then too much bandwidth for me as a game master that I was willing to deal with. Like literally, I'm getting somebody's Excel workbook back, you know what I mean, for their economics, and having to I got to QC it. Yeah, it's a job, right? Yeah. So, having said this, so I lay that particularly though on the peculiarities of trying to run the game as a play-by forum. And the badness of the vassal module itself. If there was a good vassal module out there, I think it would be, at a good forum like Quarter to Three where I hang out, where they have like discourse, you know what I mean, and you can post art, you know what I mean, all that sort of stuff. Not like a bad, archaic forum. If you had a really good vassal module, you could run a really good campaign. You'd still need a game master because you don't have 7 people in a room.
Okay.
But a great campaign if it could be run. It's and I always look at it every time I play it or game master it more that it's an experience than a game. I mean, you're playing you're playing a 10-year campaign. It shouldn't all be about winning. It should be about, wow, I feel like either A, I did really well with Austria. If you played Austria, or B, you could be like, wow, I learned a lot of lessons about playing Austria. If that makes any sense. Yeah. So that's kind of, wow, an hour's worth of Empires and Arms for you.
Yeah, how about that? I haven't had to say hardly anything. This is great.
Yeah, wonderful. No, but seriously, that the Frederick thing,
that's super interesting, actually. I did not know about that.
I was very close to having the counters custom made a few years back before I got sick and all that stuff happened, and would have had, because there are also some changes to the maps, and actually having some custom maps made and looking out there, that I think it fits that really well as a glove. There were even some other from the same people who compiled all the stuff that became Empires and Harms. They actually did some ones that were some stinkers, like it was just an attempt to take the same ideas and move them to other eras. So like there was one that really dealt with like the age of the wars of Louis XIV, and just the nature of how siege warfare worked, and they had to change sieges and how armies are supplied and worked. Just I think made it not a great game. Okay. They also tried to do like an 1848 version.
Okay.
You're crazy, right? Crazy stuff like that. Like, you're kind of leaving but really, that's how I look at it. I mean, the Napoleonics particular stuff is really interesting and fascinating, right? But it's a great multiplayer game with enough grand strategic economic grit, the enforced diplomacy system that is true of power politics in the 18th and to the end of the age of Napoleon. And you could argue Napoleon was kind of breaking and bending those rules, right? But they still held, that's how nations operated politically, etc. It represents that really well. And but at the end of the day, the key complaint is what we were talking that I've seen. Like when I get to the nub of somebody who just doesn't like it, whatever, it's basically they're like, I want to play a war game. I don't want to play a game with a lot of diplomacy.
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
That's certainly a valid choice for somebody to make. But it sounds like this is not the game for them in that case, right?
Right. And I love games, as you well know. We play them all the time, right? That have no diplomacy and a lot of game. You know what I mean? And a lot of war, right? A lot of simulation. I would argue, though, this is getting to the game as history, right? I would argue that something like War and Peace, you artificially dividing these countries that have independent interests into like a couple of alliances. You know what I mean? And fighting a grand war across is the ahistorical approach.
Yes, and that's one reason why I think the campaign for War and Peace just doesn't work, and that's actually exactly where we found that it was busted. And we had tried to do it twice. After I had thought about it, it's like, hey, we tried to do this back in the 90s too, as a multiplayer thing, and it just doesn't work because there's not infrastructure in the rules to support that. Right. You could play the campaign as a 2-player exercise, and it works fine. You could play the scenarios as either 2-player or, in some cases, as a multiplayer exercise, and they work fine. But as like a whole campaign as a multiplayer game, it just doesn't work. It's just the rules are not there to accomplish that.
Like the big complaint I've heard, like more of a philosophical complaint. There are people out there who say like, "Hey, EIA, it's not my type of game," and I get that, right?
Well, sure.
You know, right, Roger.
That's fair to say,
right? But the idea of like really, if you get down to it, like it's like, well, I can't do Austerlitz. I'm like, no, because Austerlitz is a very particular campaign. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? What you are getting is the experience of running a great power in Europe over a 10-year period.
Yes.
It's a completely different thing.
Yes. That's an operational. That's you're asking for something operational in a game that is fundamentally not operational.
Right. And the key, like for instance, if you're playing Spain, it's pretty hard politically from a running your state standpoint to do as bad a job as Carlos IV and Godoy did. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons I love playing Spain. It's like, well, you should be able to do a better job than that.
Expectations are low. That's a great point, actually.
Right. Yeah, seriously, it's like, well, no, I'm not going to make a deal to attack Portugal and welcome the French in necessarily. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm gonna barter a little harder, because that type of thing. So I really don't like any grand strategic. It was asked in the chat. Grand strategic computer games that deal with the Napoleonic era. For the very reason I laid out.
That many. There is that Empires in Arms thing that Matrix Games did, which I have seen very little traffic on.
'Tis an abortion. Can I say that on this channel?
Sure. On the live chats, yes, because the live chats are marked as not for children. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
So there's that Victory and Glory Napoleon, which John Longshore had mentioned in the chat above that he liked the computer game but not the board game version. I have no real experience with either version of that, although I think I bought the video game version. There is, of course, Rome Total War. Not Rome Total War, but Napoleon Total War, which I find... I was at one point into the Total War series. After this amount of time, I've found that they are not for me, and I no longer am interested in them because they are not meaningfully simulative of the events that they portray.
How can I phrase this? And this applies. I've seen a lot of titles mentioned there. Jihad, Total War. I can think of March of Eagles, which is a paradox.
Yeah, paradox thing. Okay, I was going to mention that.
I apply to all of them. I have zero interest in playing a grand strategic Napoleonic game where an AI runs six great powers. Yeah, you've just lost everything.
Yeah, I mean, it turns it into Europa Universalis 3 or 4, or whatever you want, where you're basically running this complicated equation. And that's because that's all that's going on, right? It's like,
Right.
well, I need to,
And,
I need to keep this factor below this level and this factor above this level, and that's all you're doing
right.
is juggling those numbers. You're just pushing values around, cells on a spreadsheet. It not. I don't think it's fun. And I tried March of Eagles. I tried it. It was just not. It just didn't hold me for more than, like, I don't know, 45 minutes.
Specifically to Dave Dogging, I'm going to say it's not about this game's AI or that game's AI. What I just described with Empires in Arms could not be simulated by Big Blue today. Period.
Well, yeah,
they're not going to be people making decisions and then turning to other countries and tendering offers. You know what I mean? And hedging bets and stuff.
Well, it's not. It's not even. I don't even think it's that. It's that. Oh, that's true. I agree with that. But it's that there is an element of interaction, whether you are talking to somebody in the room that you pulled them aside into, or corresponding to some actual person in email. Right. And there are additional dimensions to that communication that it is not possible currently with current technology anywhere for a computer to simulate.
It's a binary. It's a binary system, right? I can't go to the computer and say, "Look, I'll give you the fruits of your unconditional. I'll unconditionally surrender to you, but you have to promise me that you'll take these specific terms, and I'll give you your unconditional surrender." Mm-hmm. Because there's no logarithm backing it up, right? It's you as France, if you were playing France, Gary, saying, "I've got to play a long game with this guy, and I'm trying to court him." Right? That's the real key in the game: is how do you beat somebody, but not make an enemy for the rest of the game, right? So you're like, I've got to keep my word here. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Because I want to see if I can flip this guy in a more long-term fashion.
Yeah, because that has repercussions for the duration of the game and maybe beyond.
Right. Well, beyond, I think you should leave everything at the end of the game.
Ideally, yeah, you should.
Right. And there is such a thing as the righteous backstab, where it's like, look, I backstabbed you because I was trying to win the game. And you talk about over beer, but ultimately, though, it's that, like I said, statecraft for your country, right? If you make Prussia those promises and then do him dirty, right? He's going to be in every coalition against you for the rest of the game. Mm-hmm. Right? Britain's like, well, I can count on Prussia because he hates him.
Right.
Right.
Because it's a longer game, actually, it's that's a consideration right there, right? So in a game of Napoleonic Wars, the GMT Napoleonic Wars, for example, that's maybe not something I'd be worried about because, hey, we're going to be done in 2 hours, right? Halfway through the game. You play that game in 4 to 6 hours, generally speaking.
Right.
So this thing, though you're in for the long haul, you're playing a real, honest-to-God campaign of it that is going to take a significant time investment over the course of weeks or months or whatever, right?
Right, or a couple. I've seen a play-by-email game go for like 2 years.
Yeah, yeah. So, and maybe that's also part of the reason why I have seen, and I think you've observed, and other folks in the conversation have observed, that Empires in Arms has some appeal to people who are not traditional war gamers, specifically to RPG people. But maybe that's because I hang out with RPG people. Who would never consider sitting down and playing ASL or even a Commands and Colors type of thing, but will happily, sign up for an Empires in Arms thing that will meet once a week and play for a year and a half, right? So,
right, and that's right. And I've got my role playing gene too. I love if I'm Spain. Right. I'm his Royal Catholic Majesty. I love.
Right. You can play that up too. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Or the same gene that has me and speak about computer games, for instance. I can't wait until they come out with, if they ever do, Victoria again. Right. I'm doing like a Victoria AAR where I'm doing Make Spain Great Again.
Okay.
Right. Okay. But I love doing stuff like that. Or if I change a policy, it's because I'm, a minister who was handling all the business got fired. Mm-hmm. And stuff like that. But I think that's more appropriate to play by email, that sort of thing.
Sure.
People have different like LARPing levels that they're comfortable with. If you're around the board game, but if you look at it like from that aspect, yeah, absolutely. And the game isn't that. Yes, it's a war game, and it's got war game stuff. Okay, that normally would turn those people off. But like I said, if I say, look, here's this 30-page rule book, and it's got everything you need to know about it, no debates, whatever, and I'm the game master. So if you've got any questions, just ask me.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a factor too. Yeah. And that is a factor that helps to alleviate stress over a game that is otherwise fairly complicated.
Right. And then everything else is just like they're looking stuff up and they got the charts and, role-playing people know, there are some complicated role-playing game combat systems and whatnot. Right. So they can look at the charts and figure this stuff out. And, like I said, that last one I did had more, I would say, people with role-playing or, maybe the most they do would be something like Here I Stand, that type of thing. People involved in it, and none of them found the rules to be heavy lifting. What was heavy lifting was getting her done in terms of the I'm not talking about it again, Dave Doggy. We discussed ad infinitum the video game for Empires and Arms that was, I used the word, an abortion.
We have. It has not come highly recommended. I can tell you, it is still available. I looked at it the other day, and then went and looked at YouTube to see what video content has been done for it, and there has been very little video content done for it, which is compared to other Matrix games stuff like War in the Pacific or Grigsby games, that kind of stuff, where there's quite a lot. It's
horrific. It's a 2004 interface, and it really only works if you have 7 players. But it doesn't have any of the technology for any sort of like multi-port playing.
Well, you also have to worry about with really a lot of Matrix games items. You really do have to worry about primitive interfaces. That is a consideration in many of those titles.
Fast forwarding, like for example, right? I got my refund a couple months ago for the Operational Art of War because when they re-released it it doesn't work well with modern Windows rendering stuff, right? So literally, I've got like a 44-inch screen, but I can't see stuff even if I go like right up to the screen and look at it.
And when was that released? Like 2018 or something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredibly I was actually looking at that not that long ago, a couple months ago. It's like even like stupid stuff like the ability to change the music volume. It's like, well, why is this a half-ass feature? There's no reason for this in this day and age.
Because what they did was just slap a Windows compatibility run through, in the software department on it and re-release it, right? Well,
that's very plausible.
With a lot of freaking problems, right? So it's why I don't buy any computer game unless I can get it on Steam, because I have 2 bits of logic with that. One, it's at least got to try to be Steam compliant with all those things that go into it. Everything we just discussed.
There's a few games that have issues with that are available through Steam, but generally speaking, you buy it and install it and play it, and that's it.
Right. 2, if it's like Operational Art of War, right, which I just described, I can then get a refund.
Yeah.
That's the other reason I only get them on Steam. I for years now I'm like, I'm not downloading a damn thing from Matrix anymore. Just not going to happen, right?
I've never bought anything from them. If their stuff's not on Steam, I don't buy it.
Right? Yeah, it's just simple logic, right?
And I will say, because I'm being a little hard on him right now, like the Gary Grigsby War in the East and War in the West, although I've played a lot less of it, I actually think that's a decent, engaging game. Not particularly brilliant AI, but if you just want to grind out some East Front stuff, I think it's a pretty decent option that feels like a war game, right? Sure,
it's great. You can always it goes into nitnoid detail that no commander at your level would ever need,
or that's even absolutely true,
or ever look at. A, and then B is the Germans. You can attack and do Snowbarossa, and so pull out completely outside the borders of Russia for the winter, and then go back in and attack. That's absolutely historical.
Well,
I'm down with that.
that's
Right.
that's a bit silly, but
Yeah.
I mean, there's levels of their
Gary
products that I will put up with.
Grigsby's crap to me is on the same level if we were talking board games, the Europa craziness. I'm like, yeah, no.
Well, so the other thing is, and I'm not really sure why. So other than the AI problem, we're kind of digressing here onto how computer games. Why do computer war games suck?
Right.
So first of all, you have the AI problems, right, which we've already mentioned. But also, I mean, you if you have like a really super complicated accountanty type of game. I'll use a World at War as an example, where you literally have log sheets and you have to allocate points to these different things, and then you roll on tables to determine what those points do. All that could be automated very easily into a computer game, and yet nobody does that. Instead, you have games like Strategic Command, which has a absolutely imbecilic game engine underneath it that for the sake of making everything easy doesn't simulate anything and puts all this level of abstraction in your way to immersion, even immersion into the topic, right? And I don't understand. So for me, a board war game, not because of the nature of the medium, ends up a lot of the time being a better simulation than the computer game.
I will answer your valid comments with this quite simple statement. If I want to play a war game, I play a war game on Vassal. If I want to play any other kind of game, I play it somewhere else.
Well, yeah, that's true.
I would do it on computer. But I do not play my war games, period, on computer. Why? They suck. For everything we just discussed. Yeah. All the reasons we just discussed. But also because I don't like my war game experiences to be, I am not a puzzle solver. Mm-hmm. I am not interested going in and figuring out how this game quote unquote works and then how I can quote unquote beat it and then move on to the next thing. That's not in my gene. That gene, which can be there for other types of computer games, mm-hmm. is not there for war games.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Right. And to me, that's really the only thing they're good at.
Yeah.
Puzzle solving. Rock, paper, scissors, Panzer General, which has been done. Panzer General has been remade so many freaking times with so many different titles, it's not even funny. Mm-hmm. Rock, paper, scissors, right?
All right, so back to the topic. Since
I think the horse is dead on the topic. And I think
as far as Empires in Arms, yeah. If anybody has, I know there's been an enormous amount of questions in the chat. I will mention that that a couple of things about Napoleon's Imperium, which is on pre-order from Compass Games. Designer Andrew Rowland. Now, I thought that Andrew was Harry's son. But having watched Andrew's video about Napoleon's Imperium, that turns out not to be the case. They are, in fact, not related, and it only is coincidence that they are both war game designers named Rowland from Australia. So that was a little bit baffling, too. Napoleon's Imperium looks interesting, actually. I don't know if, Pat, you've watched the video on that. It actually, it was like a board game that they did, and it was like this guy's personal house game, and to the extent that he made like this insanely elaborate hardwood table to play it on, with like an inset map and drawers and hand-painted miniatures as the game pieces and all that. So that's Napoleon's Imperium. I don't actually have the impression that it is an attempt to be a new version of Empires in Arms. But, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all if some influence crept over. It's still working. It is not yet released, right? So we can't go in and take a look at that.
Andrew Rowland, yeah, I would think the same thing. I'd be like, whoa.
Yeah, like, what do you mean he's not related to Harry?
Oh, no, this is a card-driven-y. I can tell right.
So there's another one called Coalition, which is upcoming from Compass, which is a card-driven thing. I think there's a third one, too, that's a straight card game, the name of which eludes me. But a Coalition looks like it's an area movement game where the areas are just the countries, and that's I reserve the right to change my mind, but that looks too low granularity to be of interest to me. Another thing that I will mention, and I meant to get this out right at the beginning, was on the subject of Stanislaus Thomas, who has now done 3 strategic level Napoleonic games that I mentioned in the previous video. There's actually a 4th one that was mentioned in the video comments. That is Pitt's War. This actually also came out from Compass. It was a game in Paper Wars. And if you look at the map, it looks a great deal like the map of Napoleon in Europe, or Napoleon against Europe, with the exception that the Napoleon against Europe has sort of that green tinted center, which is basically the forage factor for that particular area. So this actually looks relatively interesting. I guess it can be played in the projected campaign games about 10 hours. For the whole campaign, and it's an 1805 to 1815 type of thing. But for those interested in maybe a little less time-intensive opportunity to play strategic level Napoleonics, this is maybe a thing. Now, Pat, you have played the old War and Peace, right?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so we're gonna find ourselves pretty much in agreement on that. I actually think it's a classic for a reason, but there are just things that it's not particularly good at, like playing the campaign as a multiplayer game. I have not played the new version from One Small Step, but a buddy of mine has it, and it appears to be, from the scenario level, it's like 98% the same game, right? They made a couple changes to just get rid of some of the weird, goofy 80s things, like the rivers and stuff like that, but which now are on the hex sides, and the component issues, which were pretty egregious, actually. But it's pretty much the same game.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I kind of said my piece. Like if you don't, you got a conundrum if you're talking about Grand Strategic Napoleon, right? We can leave it, and we probably could end it here, right?
Yeah.
With this conundrum, and the conundrum is, these are all independent states that should be making policy independently, right? And that should create the dynamic.
Yes.
And the problem is capturing that, in a heuristic way, right?
Yeah, which I would think Empires in Arms does, in a way that I'm not sure any other title does.
And its flaws are its strengths. It's really long, right? You gotta have 7 people, right? Or you're using these UMP rules and they suck.
Yeah.
Right? These bot rules.
That right there is a huge impediment to getting stuff done too.
Right. So, those are big flaws. Just objectively speaking, they're big gateways. To playing the game. That's just, with Empires in Arms, done right, with the right rule selection, all that. I'll say this: it at that scale, it plays you feel like you're in the cockpit of that country, in a way, like and everybody, and that all these other guys are in the cockpits of their countries in a way that you won't in any other game.
Yeah. Yeah, with relatively fine granularity too. I mean, the map is a fairly detailed map, and you get some. I think from what I can see, for a grand strategic game, you get some operational flavor, but just enough, and not too much, unless you start, moving into Empires in Harm territory.
Right. Like if you look at the map, right? Like each one of those cities has a spire, multiple different spires. That reflects in numbers of 5 how many strength points they can hold. There's if they're under siege, then they can you can either do an assault, which may fail, or you can start to starve them. Some of those cities have fletches, which make them their fortresses, so there's more political points for taking them if you do. As well as they're harder to take. So there is a little, it delves enough into the operational to make stuff, like you said, for flavor. But without there's supply rules to moving your stuff around. There's maintenance rules. For instance, it's cheaper in the game to have as few core as possible out, because you don't have to pay supply for just infantry and garrisons. So you can save money up.
Okay.
Because if you inherently the game assumes, oh, you've got a core out there, well then it has to forage, or you have to pay supply for it, and then every quarter you have to pay maintenance on your core because they're in the field.
Right.
So a very like ostensible peacetime strategy in the game, like from that, going from operational to strategic to economic, right, is to say, all right, I'm going to maintain a minimum amount of cores. I might be attacking this miner, so I'll keep a couple, but I want to keep all this infantry strength, so I'm going to keep them in fortresses around the country and stuff, right? For the next year. You're planning about because you want to maximize your funds, that kind of thing. So that's it.
Yeah.
Well,
so looking back to the chat, I see that John Longshore has mentioned Avalanche Press. John, please do not use profanity in my chat.
Yeah.
I would appreciate it if you would not mention them.
Why would anybody buy anything from them?
I don't know. I don't
know.
I guess there's one or two. There's folks that like Panzer Grenadier. There's folks that like Great War at Sea. There's I don't want to deal with. I don't want to deal with them.
I want bad components with a lot of typos. That's what I love.
There's a thriving community around Panzer Grenadier, as far as I can tell, and I can't figure out why. I tried to like it, I really did. Anyway,
I want obnoxious art, errors, errata. That's what I look for in my games. All right. Well, thanks for showing up, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for the lively chat and great attendance, and hopefully we'll be able to. I do not want to set a schedule for another general chat at this time, but there will almost certainly be a topical chat at some point in the future on the channel. Yeah. So thanks for coming.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. You guys have a good night.